I will also point out Brain Hacker is dead now. Brain Hacker closed down as soon as COVID started up.
Maybe update your LinkedIn profile.
Probably should, yeah. Yeah.
Some speakers don't provide bios.
I totally did. Okay. Yeah, so Brain Hacker's dead. It was cool, but it's gone. But hey, Urban Mysteries, if you want to do an escape room, yeah. So as Rubina said, my name's David. I'm going to be going through a brief guide to accessibility. This is going to be from a bit of a technical website design aspect.
I'm just going to move this out of the way.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. And because I had some free time on my hands, because it was such an early deadline, I'm using the corniest stock photography I could possibly find, because why the heck not? Now, this work? Yes, cool. No, back. There we go. I will start off with just a bit of a caveat. I know that whenever you're talking about accessibility and people with disabilities, there's a lot of sensitivities. I'll be talking about a wide variety of disabilities during this talk. I do have disabilities. I do not have a lot of the disabilities that I'm going to be talking about here, so I just wanted to flag early on. I have done my best to figure out how to refer to people with specific disabilities as most respectfully as I can. If I ever trip up, feel free to point it out, or yeah, I'll just keep going, really. A little bit about me first. As Rubina said, I've been working in the web space in Adelaide for about 10 years. I started off my accessibility journey in my first web development job when my boss at the time said that somebody needs to go off and learn a bit about accessibility and come back and teach everybody else. This business had been around for about 5 years at that point, so it's a little bit concerning that they didn't already know what accessibility was, but hey, that's what got me started, so that's okay. I wouldn't classify myself as an expert in accessibility. I've done a course, I've read as much as I can, but that really goes to show how easy it is to actually learn about it. It's purely just about having the mindset of keeping things as accessible as possible, coming to places like this or doing online courses to try to figure out how you can improve what you're doing. The other side of things for me at the moment is, as I said, Urban Mysteries Co-escape rooms. We do mystery rooms for the last year. We're about to open up a new one, which is pretty cool. And oddly enough, accessibility is a big part of what I do there as well. We try to make sure that everything keeps, vision impaired people in mind, for example, not having color-based puzzles, having clear accessibility for movement, stuff like that. It comes down to every single part of everything you do during the day. Everything could be more accessible, and it will improve the lives for basically everybody. Now, there are a few core groups about, who accessibility will actually help. The vision impaired users, so these are people with no vision or reduced vision, and color blindness, which is a massive, massive one. And I'll talk about a few ways that you can help people with color blindness down the track. Next up is hearing, so people with complete deafness or limited hearing. There we go. People with motor impairments, so limited mobility, or people with slow response times, limited fine motor skills. Whenever I talk about accessibility, usually vision or hearing impaired people are like the priority, like most of the questions that I get asked, but there's a huge portion of motor limited users, and especially recently, there's been a massive focus on cognition as well. So these are people with various learning disabilities, with dyslexia, inability to focus, and anyone on the autism spectrum. This group has been getting a lot more notice recently in the last few years. There are a few different guidelines around that really govern accessibility online, and they are in the middle of a big review to help focus on this user group a little bit more. But as I said, accessibility really does help everybody. So a few other people that accessibility is great for. 44% of Australians have a literacy level of 1 or 2 out of 6. These are people who wouldn't identify themselves as disabled or people with a disability, but they will have a substantially reduced reading level compared to the other 56%. So in this case, accessibility would be more about the language that you use, not using overly technical language, not using a $50 word when a 20-cent word will do. Next up, 29% of Australia's population were born overseas, and 22% are only second-generation Australian. Again, not people who would identify as having a disability for obvious reasons, but the language that you use, the techniques that you use, things that might be specific to a user group that you're thinking of that might not include people who weren't born in Australia or don't speak the language natively. And finally, because why the heck not, accessibility would help the 17% of people who browse the internet on their phone while in the toilet. Obviously not a disability, and personally I feel like this is just the 17% of people who would admit to using their phone on the toilet. It's probably a lot larger than that, but these people are really going to benefit from a lot of the same accessibility techniques that hearing impaired people would. You're not going to be sitting on the toilet watching a video with the sound blaring, for example. So anything to do with hearing impaired, captions, things like that would really help these people too. Now, I always hate having to include a slide like this because it should be really obvious why we care, but here are a few key points just in case you need to go back and talk to anyone in your organizations why you should be focusing on this sort of thing. The obviously most altruistic reason is improving the lives of those with disabilities. Not going to go too much into that because if you don't get that, yeah, you're going to have some issues anyway. Enlarging your target market. Now, I have always had clients, as soon as I start talking about accessibility, whenever I'm building them a new website or anything like that, they start saying, well, I can't have deaf people in my clientele anyway, or dog trainers. I have a dog trainer client in Victoria, and I will specify Victoria because I also have a few in SA, and they are perfect. But in Victoria, I talk to them, and they say, well, I can't have a vision impaired people out there training the dog and things like that, so it's not something that I care about. But I need to explain to these people that it's not always going to be the person with the disability that is going to be using your service, but it's not up to you to decide that your content shouldn't be accessible to those people. It could be a vision impaired parent trying to organize something for their child, like, for example, the dog trainer. It could be a parent that is trying to organize for their dog and their child to go off to obedience school or something like that, or to organize classes. It's not up to you. So the goal is to make things as accessible as possible, so that way people with disabilities can make the decision for themselves, which is the really important part. Next up, avoiding lawsuits. Now, this has happened a few times. Specifically, it comes, not a lawyer, not gonna pretend I am, but it comes down to the Disability Discrimination Act of 1992. Most of the accessibility-based lawsuits that have happened in Australia come back to that act. It is about making your content, your websites, your social media presence, anything like that, as accessible to people with disabilities as it would be to people without disabilities. If you don't do that, there is a risk that you could be seen as discriminating against people with disabilities. Now, the few examples of that, the earliest one that I know of was the Sydney Olympics. The Olympic Organizing Committee was actually sued because a person with vision impairment wasn't able to get into their booking system. More recently, I think it was Coles had a very similar issue because their online ordering system wasn't accessible, so someone wasn't able to get through and actually order their goods. Now, this is especially important since for any normally abled person, you can just get in the car, go down to the shops, get things really easily. But if you've got anything that kind of prohibits you getting out of the house really easily, you rely on these online systems to be able to, get through your day-to-day life. And if those online systems aren't built for you, then it can take you from, trying to have a normal life to having things even more difficult. It's basically like if every building was, built a meter up and some had stairs, some didn't have stairs. Like, I would have trouble getting into half of the buildings around the place if that were the case. And when you go to visit a website, you don't want to have to take that gamble whether or not you're going to be able to actually use it. And finally, for government departments and in some cases, organizations who have a lot of funding from government, it is actually the law. Government departments have to maintain at least a level A level of accessibility, and I'll explain what that actually means later, and it's soon to be level AA as well. So if you work for a government department, then it is something that you really have to focus on. So our goal is basically making the internet more accessible, which is better for literally everybody. It doesn't matter if you think you have a disability or not, it is going to help you. And hey, party kids, that's always fun too. Now, how do we judge accessibility? And I'm going to be fully honest, I only included this slide because I wanted to have this photo in here. I have no idea what she's doing. But it's really not as complicated as this lady is making it look. So there's a few ways we judge accessibility. The first is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Now, this part is going to get a little bit technical. I'll talk about a few things that it's really good for you to know, a few concepts for you to know, mainly because if you haven't got the technical skill to do things yourself, it can be really good to at least know these concepts, so when you go off and talk to a web developer, you will know what kind of things you need to talk about, and if they start pouting off some technical jargon, you have a chance of actually understanding it. And also, if they start saying that accessibility isn't really important for you, you can say, shut the hell up, obviously it is. So, level A, as I said, this is the mandatory for government sites at the moment. They are aiming to have it level AA, but at the moment it's just A. It's the bare absolute minimum level of accessibility for websites. Every single website in the world should reach this. Unfortunately, many of them don't. It's actually fairly difficult not to. It really depends if you've got control over images on your site and things like that. If you don't reach level A, then you've got some problems, to be honest. AA is the ideal target. It's going to be the mandatory for government websites, so fairly soon. Meets most accessibility goals. It basically covers things like color contrast, making sure everything has alt tags, which I'll explain in a moment, making sure that everything is navigatable by a keyboard. So if you can't use a mouse or you have limited fine motor movement, you need to be able to navigate everything basically using the tab, spacebar, shift buttons, things like that. And if you want to, when you get home tonight, have a go at that, it can actually be pretty difficult. But that is something that basically everybody can try. If you've got your laptop or anything, load up a website and just try exploring it without using your cursor. It can be kind of revealing. If you ever talk to a developer and they say that they're going to build you an accessibility website or an accessible website, or if they have a focus on accessibility, AA is probably what they're going to be talking about. Now, AAA, highest possible level according to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, not realistic in most cases and not necessary in most cases. There are very few situations where you would actually need level AAA. This basically comes down to being able to pause the entire website, having time-based events, things like that. It's a very, very high level. There are certain parts of government websites that will need this, but if you're going back and trying to get your website more accessible, AA is what you need to be going for. Now, because we all love acronyms, I hate this acronym. It's not my acronym, but it is very useful. Basically, everything that you're going to be looking at with accessibility comes down to POUR, which is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So ironically, the goal is to have a poor website, and my soul died a little bit just saying that, but it works. So perceivable, can users see the content? Obviously, for vision impaired users, we're not talking about literally seeing it, but can they access your content? If you have vision impairment, this would include having alt tags in all of the images to make sure that if you can't see, you can at least hear it. Most vision impaired users will be using screen readers, and if you have images that don't have alt tags, then it will basically just read out an image, which isn't going to be helpful for anybody. Next up, we have operable. Can the content be used? Now, this, again, will relate a lot more to people with mobility issues, so limited mobility or no mobility, again, using things like keyboard navigation or, in some extreme cases, eye movement to navigate websites. You need to try to make sure your website would be operable if you can't use a mouse, if you have very limited mobility. Next up, understandable. Can users comprehend your content? This basically equates to the reading level that would be required for any user accessing your website. There are guidelines in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that set a specific reading level. So basically, everything that you write, make sure that it is going to be understandable without, a university degree. As I said before, the certain amount of people that have a level 1 or 2 reading level in Australia is fairly high. So in this case, it's only using technical jargon when you specifically need to. If there is any simpler ways of using a phrase, if there are any straightforward language choices you can make rather than using idioms or turns of phrase, things like that. Everyone loves a good idiom, but it's not always going to be accessible. So if someone says like beat around the bush, for example, if you have someone for whom English isn't a first language, they might not have any idea what you're talking about. So if you can say something straightforward in plain English, it will usually be better. And finally, can your content be viewed on all devices without breaking? Now, to an extent, this is talking about responsive websites. So can your website be viewed on everything from a large desktop down to a mobile phone? But it also relates to assistive technologies. So is your website going to be built well enough that if an overlay for a screen reader or a keyboard assistant is in place, will everything still work? Will everything still look good, or will it just break into a million pieces? And that is something that can be interesting to test, but there's a few tools to be able to do that. So I'll go through a few quick accessibility concepts. So these are basically things that if you have access to a CMS for your website, you will probably be able to manage some of these things. And what a pretty picture. So first up, alt text or alternate text. This is one of the bare minimum accessibility concepts that you should try to get your head around. Basically, every content management system will let you edit the alt text for something. It is definitely needed for vision impaired users. If someone is using a screen reader, every time it gets to the alt text, it will read out what is in there. So it should be something short, punchy, basically just a short description of what is in this image. Never use photo of or image of as the start of the alt text, because that is obvious. It's going to be a photo of or an image of. The only time you would use something like that is potentially if it's an illustration, because that's not going to be as likely. And it can be pertinent to the user that it's an illustration of a dinosaur riding a pig as opposed to a photo of it. Explain the focal point and the background if necessary, and is not needed for purely decorative images. So if you have any text dividers or fancy borders or anything like that, a vision impaired user does not necessarily need to know that those are there. It will basically be a waste of time for them. So we don't use it for that. And a few examples. So where are we? There we go. Yeah, I had fun. So in this case, it would be a photo of a mime in a black and white shirt with red suspenders holding an iron up pretending it's a telephone. See, the problem there is I started that with a photo of, which I really shouldn't have. It would just be a mime in black and white striped shirt with red suspenders holding an iron like it's a telephone. Next up, and this was a trick one because this basically adds nothing. This is a purely decorative one. So for this alt text, you would basically just leave the field blank, and if your content management system is, remotely good or remotely knows what it's talking about, it won't put anything in there. Now, the danger with some content management systems, and for example, specifically Word, I know not specifically a content management system, but it's one of the tools that tries to automatically generate alt text for you. It is often wildly, wildly off. You should always try to set something yourself if you can. In a previous version of this presentation, I had a photo of Barack Obama delivering a State of the Union speech, and the alt text that Word suggested for me was "man in tie." Like, it's not useful, it's not relevant. Always try to set something yourself if you can. And finally, who wants to try to write some alt text for this one? Donut on dog's head? Yeah, that's good. It's a little bit short. It could be a little bit longer. So, for example, why is there a donut on his head? So, for example, pink donut with sprinkles sitting on top of a Labrador's head. See, the problem with some alt text, it definitely needs to be purely descriptive. You would really hope that the text around this photo on a website is going to give some context for why this is happening, but it's not your job in the alt text to explain the context. The job is really to explain the photo. Okay, next up, color contrast. This is very important, especially for website design and also just any content creation. So this is very important for users with vision issues like glaucoma or color blindness. I've got two examples up here. I generally just assume most people in here would probably be able to read the top one, but that is very inaccessible. Anyone with a certain type of color blindness or glaucoma, anything like that, would have a lot of trouble reading that, purely because the text color is so close to the background color. As opposed to the bottom one, yellow on purple is much more accessible. The ratio of the color difference is much higher. So the color contrast is the difference between the background and the foreground color, and this also needs to be kept in mind when it's photos as the background and then text as the foreground. It's displayed as a ratio between 1 and 21. So 1 to 21 would basically be black and white. 1 to 1 would be yellow on yellow. And the bare minimum, I think, needs to be 1 to 4 or something like that in the content accessibility guidelines. But there's a few tools that you can use to try to test this. And thankfully, in a lot of CMSs, but specifically WordPress being the one I've got the most experience with, if you pick background colors and foreground colors in there, it will pop up with a warning for you that this might be more difficult to read if you have any color blindness. And I know there are a lot of other systems that are starting to give warnings like that as well, which is really, really good. Back in the day, back when I started trying to explore using WordPress themes or anything like that, the real trend was having a light gray background with a slightly darker gray text. It looked elegant as hell, but it was so inaccessible. The number of times I had to use one of those themes and then just subtly start changing the colors so that it would actually work, and then the designers would come over and start bugging me about why it looks different to their design. It's not good. That's why it's really good working for myself now, because every time I design a website, I can make it accessible to begin with. If you're the accessibility nerd in a web studio, you will have to have lots of arguments. But it is a good argument to have. Next up, readable text. So what is she doing? Anyway, readable text. So the writing style that you use on a website or in posts, anything like that, affects nearly all users with disabilities, and again, just anyone with a slightly lower reading level or language difficulties, anything like that. Now, the recommendation to keep things short, have 3 to 5 sentences at most in paragraphs, that is going to be subjective. That is basically what I recommend in terms of accessibility. I know there will be a lot of copywriters out there that might be sitting there pinching themselves right now because I'm telling people the wrong advice, but from an accessibility point of view, this is definitely good. Now, this is for a lot of people with disabilities, but specifically some people on the autism spectrum, or if you have dyslexia, inability to focus, things like that. If you have massive, massive blocks of text, then it can be a hell of a lot more difficult to actually get through text. And again, avoid idioms, wasted words that cause confusion. I've been seeing so many ads on Facebook recently for, it's not Grammarly, but it's pretty similar. It basically goes through and cuts out any words that just aren't needed, and you'd be surprised how many of them there are. So it can always be good to review your text multiple times to start trimming it down as much as possible to keep things readable and not too verbose. And finally, links. Obviously, links on websites are very important. They are especially important for people with screen readers and for general accessibility. The big issue that a lot of people have with links on websites is the fact that they all use things like read more or click here, things like that. A lot of people that use keyboard navigation, they navigate through a website using the tab, which will often jump down 2 different links. So you need to have some more descriptive link text, but don't make it too long. If you ever use a screen reader, screen readers will most of the time read out the full text of the link. So if you end up linking an entire paragraph, the person using a screen reader is going to be sitting there for half an hour when all they want to know is where this link goes to. So you can link basically a full sentence if you have to, but try to make it more descriptive. Don't use click here or read more. If you need to, you can say, click here to get in touch with us, or click here to read our sponsorship prospectus, or anything like that, just to give people a bit more of a guide on where it's going. Now, part of the reason is screen readers, part of the reason is for people with limited mobility. For any normally abled person, you can jump in and out of links pretty easily. You know, just open a new tab if it's not what you want, jump back. If you've got limited mobility or have trouble navigating around a website, it can be a massive hassle opening up something just to find out that's not what you need, this isn't what you thought it was, and needing to go back. It can be a big problem. So just try to use something a little bit more descriptive. Now, finally, I do have a bunch of tools and resources that can be really useful. So these are different simulators, different tools to cut down text, things like that. Obviously can't have all of the URLs up here, but if you take a photo of this or give it a scan, you'll head to a page on my website that basically lists all of them. They can be really useful, specifically the color blindness sim. You can give a URL to an image or to a website, pick different types of color blindness, and it will change it so you can see how people would see it if they have color blindness. The readability test tool and Hemingway app, they're both really good for, as I said, cutting out wasteful words, lowering the language levels, things like that. The dyslexia simulator, this isn't something that you can pump your text into, but I found this really interesting because it's basically a website that jumps around the letters. It keeps all the words together, but it jumps around the letters, so you can look at it and get a bit of a feeling for how people with dyslexia actually read. It can be really difficult. I'm sure we've probably all seen the thing getting around social media where all the letters are jumbled up in a word and people can still read it. That's cool, but all the letters just keep changing. I read through a couple of paragraphs and it takes quite a while. And finally, the color contrast analyzer. Now, this is a tool that I've been using for my entire career. Every time I get sent a design, every time I'm trying to make a design. Honestly, I ran it through the Digital Adelaide website this morning just to double check. It is okay. Honestly, I saw the blue on blue and I was thinking, oh, that's not gonna be quite right, but it's okay. It's actually accessible, yeah. Yeah, you basically put in the hex codes for the foreground and the background and it tells you how accessible it is, and it will tell you how accessible it is on each of those levels, the A, AA, AAA, which can be really useful. And I will point out the Digital Adelaide branding as well, because when I started talking to designers about accessibility, I was doing some work with the RSB and with our in-house designers at my old job, and everyone really had the assumption that if something was going to be accessible, it had to be black text on a white background, or it had to be really stark and bare. It really doesn't have to be. The branding on the Digital Adelaide banner here, that is actually accessible, and it looks bloody great, to be honest. I can't say anything for the rest of the website, because I haven't done an actual accessibility audit, but from the color perspective, it's quite good. So that is basically everything from me. I've got no idea how my time's going. Yeah. Bye.